The moment Chuka shut the door, his heart pounded like a war drum. He pressed his back against the wooden frame, squeezing his eyes shut as if that could block out the chaos outside. But the world didn't care about his silent plea. Sirens wailed, their red and blue flashes slicing through the early morning haze. The commotion outside grew louder. Frantic voices, hurried footsteps, and the distinct clang of metal against metal. Something was happening. Something big. Then came the knock. Not just a knock, but a pounding so forceful that the door trembled. Chuka flinched, his breath hitching. It wasn't his neighbors anymore. This was different. It carried authority, urgency, danger. He swallowed hard and turned toward the bed where Sonia's body lay, motionless and pale. A deep chill wrapped around his spine. He had spent the entire night trapped in this room with her corpse, trying to figure out what to do, but now there was no more time. The pounding continued. Open up! Police! Chuka's mind raced. How? How did they know? Had someone seen her coming last night? Had a neighbor heard something? Or had they already suspected him? His tongue felt dry, sticking to the roof of his mouth. If he didn't open the door, they would break it down, and that would only make things worse. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob, hesitating. But before he could turn it, the door burst open with a violent crack, sending him staggering backward. Two officers stormed in, guns drawn. On the ground! Now! One of them barked. Chuka barely had time to process before strong hands grabbed him, shoving him to the cold tiled floor. A knee dug into his back as handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. I didn't do anything, he gasped, his face pressed against the floor. I swear, I shut up. An officer snapped. Then, after a quick scan of the room, his voice changed, laced with something darker. God, she's dead. Silence followed. Thick, suffocating. One officer moved toward the bed, checking for a pulse, even though it was obvious she was gone. Call it in, he muttered to his partner. We've got a body. Chuka's pulse hammered in his ears. This was it. His life, his freedom. It was all slipping away. His mind screamed at him to say something, to explain. But what could he possibly say that would make them believe him? The officer, studying Sonia's body, frowned. No visible wounds, no blood, no signs of struggle. He turned to Chuka, his gaze sharp. Did you kill her? No. Chuka shook his head frantically. I woke up and she wasn't breathing. I don't know what happened. His voice cracked, but he wasn't sure if it was panic or the realization that no one would believe him. The officer scoffed. Right, a young, healthy woman just dies in your bed with no explanation, and you didn't think to call the police? Chuka opened his mouth, but no words came. He had no good answer. Every decision he had made since opening his eyes this morning had only made things worse. The second officer, who had been speaking into his radio, turned back to them. Sonia's family has been contacted. They're on their way. Chuka's blood ran cold. Her family. They didn't know the life she had been living. They wouldn't believe she was here on her own accord. They would think he lured her here, hurt her, used her. And when they saw the way he lived, the expensive clothes, the flashy car parked outside, the designer watches, they would assume the worst. Ritualist. The word hung in his mind like a noose tightening around his throat. In this country, a young man living well without a clear source of income was always a suspect. Now, with Sonia dead in his bed, that suspicion would become a conviction. The first officer grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. You're coming with us! As they dragged him out of the apartment, the gathered crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Faces he had known for years stared at him with wide eyes, some with pity, others with disgust. His neighbors, the same ones who had shared drinks with him, laughed with him, now looked at him like a monster. Then he saw the police van parked outside, and standing beside it was a group of people. Sonia's family. A woman older, with tears streaming down her face, rushed forward. You! You killed my daughter, she screamed, clawing at him. You murdered her. Chuka flinched, trying to pull away, but her pain-filled rage was relentless. The officers restrained her, but her screams echoed in his ears, stabbing at whatever was left of his sanity. We will make sure you rot in prison. A man, probably Sonia's brother, shouted, pointing a shaking finger at him. Chuka wanted to fight back, to yell that he didn't do it, that he wasn't a killer. But his voice was drowned out by the rising roar of the crowd. In their eyes, he was already guilty. As he was shoved into the police van and the doors slammed shut, he realized one thing: no one was coming to save him. Chuka sat in his holding cell, the dim light flickering overhead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked concrete walls. The reality of his situation was beginning to settle in, suffocating him like a thick blanket. He had barely eaten in 2 days, and the interrogations had drained him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sonia's lifeless body, the way her lips had turned pale, her hands cold. How did it all go so wrong? Outside the police station, chaos brewed. Sonia's family had taken to social media, spreading their grief, their rage, and their accusations like wildfire. They were a well-known and respected family, and their cries for justice reached powerful ears. Soon, the claims that Chuka had used Sonia for money rituals gained traction, fueled by public outrage and the media. With every passing hour, more people gathered outside the station chanting for his head. Ritualist, murderer, he must pay. The pressure on the police was mounting. They had to act fast. The lead investigator, Officer Balogun, slammed a fresh file onto his desk. We're charging him. The younger officer hesitated. Sir, the autopsy isn't conclusive yet. The toxicology report is still... We don't have time, Balogun snapped. The public wants blood, and her family is pressing hard. The commissioner himself called me this morning. If we don't take this to court, we'll have a riot on our hands. The younger officer sighed but nodded. I'll file the paperwork. Within hours, the official charge was made. Murder. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and curious onlookers squeezed into the benches. Chuka sat in the defendant's chair, his face blank, his hands trembling beneath the table. His lawyer, an overworked public defender, whispered, "Stay calm. We'll argue lack of evidence." The prosecution, however, was relentless. Sonia's family sobbed openly as their lawyer painted Chuka as a manipulative predator who had targeted vulnerable women. They paraded old photos of him flaunting his wealth, questioned his source of income, and called in character witnesses who only added to the growing suspicion. His neighbors took the stand. Some spoke of his kindness, but others hesitated. That night, something fell off, one admitted. He wouldn't let us inside. He acted strange. Then came Sonia's best friend. She took a deep breath before speaking. Sonia never told her family about her work. She was involved in hookups. She met Chuka that night for business. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Sonia's mother broke down in fresh wails. Lies! She would never! The judge banged the gavel. Order in the court, but it didn't matter. Public perception had already sealed his fate. After weeks of trial, the verdict was read. Guilty. Chuka barely heard the rest. 25 years. His mother collapsed in the courtroom. His friends sat in stunned silence. Sonia's family embraced, crying tears of justice. Chuka closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He had lost. As he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his new reality crushed him. This wasn't just a sentence. This was the end of his life. The moment the metal gates closed behind him, Chuka felt his fate was sealed. Prison was nothing like the outside world. No freedom, no dignity, just survival. The days blurred into each other, filled with exhaustion, fear, and the suffocating weight of regret. He barely spoke, barely ate. Time crawled, dragging him deeper into despair. Months passed. His once vibrant body grew frail. his mind dulled by suffering. But nothing prepared him for the sickness that took hold, relentless fevers, weakness, a slow creeping death. The worst part, he didn't even care anymore. Then one day, he was summoned for a visit. He hadn't had one in years. When he stepped into the visitation room, his breath caught. Sitting across the glass was Sonia's best friend. His body tensed. She was one of the voices that had damned him in court. "I need to talk to you," she said. His fists clenched. "What do you want?" She hesitated, then leaned forward. "Because I think you were set up." Chuka stared at Sonia's best friend, his heart pounding. He wanted to laugh, to curse, to yell at her for daring to show up after helping send him here. But all he could do was glare. "Set up?" he finally muttered, his voice hoarse from years of silence. "What are you talking about?" She exhaled sharply, guilt flickering in her eyes. "I didn't know the truth back then. I just said what I thought I knew. But now, things aren't adding up." Chuka leaned closer. "Explain." She hesitated, looking around as if afraid someone might be listening. "Sonia was in trouble that night. More trouble than I realized. She called me before she met you. She was scared." A cold wave washed over Chuka. "Scared of what?" "She owed money," she whispered. "A lot of money? To people you don't mess with." Chuka's fingers tightened around the phone. "And you're telling me this now?" "I was afraid," she admitted. "And I didn't know the full story. But after you were convicted, I started hearing things. The people Sonia was dealing with, they made someone disappear before." Chuka's blood ran cold. "She might have been dead before you even woke up," she continued. "I don't think you killed her, Chuka. I think someone else did." A heavy silence filled the room. Chuka closed his eyes, anger and despair boiling inside him. He had lost 10 years of his life for something he didn't do. But the worst part, no one had ever bothered to look deeper. Chuka's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I expect you to listen," Sonia's friend shot back. "I know I helped put you in here, but I swear I didn't know the whole story. I thought you deserved to know the truth." Chuka's mind raced. If what she was saying was true, then someone out there had let him take the fall for a crime he didn't commit. "Why now?" he finally asked. She hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from her bag, pressing it against the glass. It was an old message, barely readable, but Chuka recognized the sender's name immediately. Sonia. "She sent this to me that night, way before you met her," she said. "I never checked it until recently." His eyes scanned the words. "I think I have been drugged." A sharp chill shot down his spine. His head throbbed. His body ached. 10 years. 10 years wasted in a place that had drained the life out of him. "Tell someone," he said, his voice raw. "I already did," she whispered. "That's why you're getting out." Chuka's breath caught. She swallowed hard. "You're getting a pardon, Chuka. The president signed it this morning." Everything inside him went still. A guard tapped his shoulder. "Time's up." As he stood, the weight of it all crushed him. Relief, rage, disbelief. He was finally leaving this hell. But the truth, that was just beginning. Chuka stepped out of the prison gates, inhaling the fresh air like a man who had been drowning for years. The sun felt different on his skin, unfamiliar yet warm. His mother and a few close friends rushed toward him, their faces streaked with tears of joy and relief. He was free, but something inside him felt broken beyond repair. The first few weeks outside were strange. Everything had moved on without him. Friends had built new lives. The city had changed, and he no longer knew where he belonged. Nights were the worst, haunted by nightmares of prison, the suffocating darkness, and the merciless hands that had robbed him of his dignity. He never spoke of it. He couldn't. Then the sickness began. It started with fatigue, then constant fevers, and then the weight loss. He barely had an appetite. His mother fussed over him, assuming it was just stress or the years of malnutrition catching up with him. But as weeks turned into months, his condition worsened. One day, after collapsing in the bathroom, he was rushed to the hospital. The test came back, HIV, advanced stage. His mother clutched her chest, wailing in disbelief. His friends sat in stunned silence. Chuka just stared at the ceiling, his face expressionless. He already knew where this was headed. He fought, oh how he fought. He took the medications, he followed the treatments, he prayed, but his body had endured too much. His immune system was failing, and every day felt like a war he was slowly losing. One evening, surrounded by his mother, his brother, and a few friends who had stayed, Chuka exhaled a shaky breath. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. The weight of injustice, of pain, of suffering, it had all drained him. "I didn't deserve this," he whispered. A tear slipped down his mother's cheek as she gripped his frail hand. And then after years of fighting, Chuka surrendered. His breathing slowed, then stopped. Silence filled the room. His mother let out a heart-wrenching cry, her son slipping away in her arms. The boy they once knew, full of life, laughter, and dreams, was gone. Justice had come too late, and in the end, the system had taken more from him than just his freedom.